I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the politics of France. As the first phase of the French presidential elections concluded on Sunday, April 23rd, with a field of 7 candidates being reduced to 2, who will now face off on Sunday, May 7th. Emmanuel Macron, the young, 39-year-old, handsome, former investment banker who heads the pro-EU En Marche party. And he has never held public office before. And the highly controversial Marine Le Pen, the 48-year-old lawyer and political pro who heads the anti-EU National Front party. And why should we care, as Americans and as American Jews? Normally, if the world were not in chaos and turmoil, we probably wouldn't, except for those Americans involved in foreign relations or international political junkies or Francophiles. But we are clearly not in normal times. The political order is under assault in more and more Western countries. Emmanuel Macron, who won the 7-person runoff, is a total political outsider. In fact, neither Macron nor Le Pen are affiliated with either of the 2 French political parties that have traditionally governed France. Some of the same currents that swept political outsider Donald Trump into the White House. Despite all that condescension that spewed forth out of the media every day, telling us there was absolutely no path to 270. That same current seems to be driving political movements in other Western nations as well. Brexit, Great Britain's surprise vote to leave the EU, is one example. And now the French presidential primaries, where voters chose 2 individuals outside the traditional politics of France, one of whom, Marine Le Pen, advocates far-right policies. It's seen as an event that can have economic and social repercussions that could well affect the character of all of Western society, including our own here in America. And then there's the eternal Jewish question. Is it good for the Jews? And in this French election, this is neither a hypothetical nor theoretical question. In addition to Marine Le Pen's policy positions, in which she advocates France's leaving the European Union and opposes France's open borders, Marine's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who himself led the National Front Party for 40 years till 2011, he is seen as a Holocaust trivializer, describing the gas chambers as a mere detail of history not worth more than 2 pages in a history of World War II. And he accused French President Chirac of being bought by the Jews, especially the B'nai B'rith. So while his daughter Marine has tried to rehabilitate the family name within the French Jewish community, there are many Jews who fear her election, should she defeat Macron, could exacerbate anti-Semitism and anti-Israel expressions within France. Well, to give us a first-hand account of the implications of the French elections and a preview of what's to come, I'm so pleased to have on our JBS phones from Paris once again, Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, who heads the European office of the American Jewish Committee. Simone, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Simone, well, first of all, you heard how I described the situation. How would you assess the results of the French presidential runoff elections?
You said it all, to be very honest. No, it's a very good assessment of the current situation here in France. How I would describe the last couple of weeks and months before the election is volatile. Most French people and Jews, certainly in particular, are very nervous. There have been every single day a major event happening, a major tsunami, a scandal happening over the last couple of weeks. And we have really seen a sort of a reshuffling of the traditional party system as it used to be the case under the Fifth Republic. As you mentioned, it's the first time that you will not have two of the main parties represented in the second round of the presidential election. While only 5 years ago, both parties constituted about 56% of the electoral vote, they now constitute 30% less of that vote. So we have an extremely volatile situation where the traditional party system has broken up, and something where most is being guided by emotions. There is very little rationality that is happening. So most of the votes that are coming out are really sort of very emotional, which means that the center has really broken apart, and we see the extremes growing to a great extent. Both the extreme right, the far right, Marine Le Pen's National Front Party, and the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, who also gained nearly 20%, constitute about 42% of the vote that in the first round of the presidential election. So the center that would sort of constitutes the very basis of our liberal democracy is in the process of breaking apart. And Emmanuel Macron, as you mentioned, who is a new politician, has only created his party about a year ago, is capturing part of that vote. But it will really take a little bit of time to see what will come out of it. Who will win? Will it be the extremes, or will it be sort of the moderate center that will be recaptured partly by Emmanuel Macron?
Very interesting. Simone, many people in America were taken totally by surprise by the victory of Donald Trump. Were you surprised by the outcome of the runoff? And in general, did people see this coming, or was it as surprising for you as it was for Americans?
No, it was not surprising. First of all, contrary to the United States, we've had the Front National, and in particular the populist movements, present in the elections for a while already. The National Front was the first party, as they considered themselves and publicly said so for quite a while, both in the European parliamentary elections and in the regional elections last time. So it's not a surprise. Opinion polls over the last weeks and months have continuously said that the National Front and Marine Le Pen will be in the second round of the presidential election. So no, it's not a surprise.
Okay. You also said that it was a function of emotion. What's driving the emotion in France, Simone? And does that emotion in any way trouble you or threaten you?
So you've had me before on the show, and before when I described what was going on, in particular related to anti-Semitism, I've always said that to me, anti-Semitism is the first symptom, the canary in the coal mine, something that is sort of the first symptom, the first signal that something is going wrong within a liberal democracy. And I think this is exactly what's happening now. We see now a profound crisis within France's liberal democracy. The emotions are guided by several things. First of all, a feeling that most French people have, that the political class, the establishment, now we've heard a lot in the presidential elections and the campaign over the last weeks and months, the system is not working anymore. So there's a distrust of the political system, of the state, of the government, of politicians, and yes, even of the media. Second of all, the feeling that within the European Union, we are losing. That somehow we are losing our sovereignty, and to some extent that there are processes that are taking place without the sovereignty of the people, and that at the end of the day, nothing really beneficial is coming out of the European Union. A feeling that, with the refugee crisis, that the European Union has taken a long time to act. A feeling that the European Union is imposing quite a lot of economic constraints on France without the benefits. So this is another aspect that comes with it. And first and foremost, I think, is also the aspect of course, Islamist terrorism that has hit France over the last couple of years. A feeling that whatever has been decided over the last two by the last two presidents has not worked. That we have within our midst radicalized individuals, that there is a threat by radical Islam that is being posed to France, and also a feeling of cultural insecurity, a feeling that there are parallel societies that are being created within our country, and that people feel that they're losing their Frenchness, their, how can I say, national identity. Mm-hmm. So I think all of this, you add it up and you put a little bit of social media, a little bit of algorithms in this, and you create a lot of panic and emotions.
Very interesting again. Look, you mentioned three items in particular. You said people in France feel the system hasn't worked, the political system has not worked. They feel the EU has taken more than it's given, and that France is losing out by being part of the EU. And then people are concerned about Islamic terrorism, and it's related to immigration and open borders. You and I, and Jews all over the world, have thrived in liberal democracy. And so the Jewish community has traditionally been a champion of liberal democratic causes. At the same time, Jews all over the world, in America and in France, we're part of the world. We see what's going on. And as I'm listening to you talk about the three things that you feel influenced this election, I'm thinking to myself, number one, at least two of them reflect what happened here in the United States, a rejection of the system and some concern about American safety after 9/11 and what we see happening in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, etc. My question for you is, given who you are and the background you've had, and you've worked in human rights activities your entire professional career, to what extent are the concerns that you mentioned, the system hasn't worked, the EU has taken more than it's given, and Islamic terrorism is a threat, to what extent are those, as troubling as it may be to you, accurate descriptions of where things stand in France? To what extent are people making more out of this, all three, than they should?
I think all of them are accurate. The question is what kind of answer you give to the questions. And I think that populists generally thrive in an environment when traditional moderate centrist parties don't tackle the issues. They take up the oxygen whenever it's not being tackled by the traditional parties. So this is the case with Marine Le Pen. When no one wanted to speak about Islamist terrorism, she would. When no one would speak about the failure to some extent of Europe, she would. The problem is that she's giving populist, extremely simplistic answers to very, very complicated questions. So, but she's able to thrive if the issues are not being taken up by the traditional parties. So I think this is something that we've seen, and to some extent, without wanting to meddle in the American elections, to some extent, it's also something that we've seen there. Whenever people don't want to use the term, for example, of Islamist extremism, it's a problem. Because others will take it up. So we live in an extremely, extremely complex world, and it's, I think, the duty of responsible, moderate leaders to take up the issues and to try and give complex answers to very complex questions, and not leave the space for populists who just give easy answers and fear-mongering So that's basically my answer.
Very, very good. I want you to give me a sense of how the Jewish community feels about each of the candidates, if you think there is a general consensus. Again, I mentioned that Marine Le Pen's father was someone who was viewed as an anti-Semite, and there are many people who are concerned, at least from the American Jewish perspective, about France's electing someone with a father, and the father and daughter were very close and were political allies within the same party. Whether there is concern in France, what will happen to the Jewish community if Marine Le Pen is elected? At the same time, she's gone out of her way to try to distance herself and reject her father's anti-Semitic reputation. Let's start with her. What does the Jewish community feel about Marine Le Pen, and what would happen if she did win the runoff? She's not expected to, but what would happen if she did?
So how can I say, the established Jewish community, the Jewish community organizations have overwhelmingly really taken position against the National Front and in favor of Emmanuel Macron. From the CRIF, which is the umbrella organization for the Jewish communities here in France, to even the great rabbi, everybody has taken the position against the National Front for several reasons, because, as you mentioned, the party itself has a history, a Vichy history, a history of Holocaust revisionism, and despite the fact that Marine Le Pen has made considerable effort in distancing herself from her father and trying to detoxify the image of the party, there still remain elements, individuals within the party who are strongly, strongly problematic. One example, actually, she just stepped down yesterday as the leader of the party to be able to sort of open up the party. She put in her place a new president of the party, and that individual actually happens to be a strong admirer of the Marechal Pétain. He has also, in a book, given an interview in which he revised, minimalized slightly the Holocaust. So you still have these kind of individuals within the party. And this is why the establishment of the Jewish community very, very clearly has positioned itself against the National Front. Mm-hmm. That being said, there are individuals, minority groups within the Jewish community, I would say in particular those who suffer from anti-Semitism on a daily basis, who live in a very difficult neighborhood, and they have sometimes had a logic of thinking that my enemy's enemy is my friend. That to some extent, given that Marine Le Pen has been so outspoken and so tough on Islamist extremism, maybe it would be a good idea to reach out to her. I do believe it's still a minority. We don't have numbers on that. The only numbers that we have are those who voted in Israel, French people who voted in Israel on the first round of the presidential election. And there, the numbers of voters for Marine Le Pen is extremely low, below 4%. So this is the only kind of indication that we have of French Jews voting for the National Front and Marine Le Pen.
In the runoff, the two ended at the top and also very close. Is there any, as I said, at the moment people expect Macron to win, but I don't know whether he has a commanding lead for the May 7th election or not. Where do things stand between the two of them?
So the polls have consistently given him the advantage of winning. It stands between 60 to 63-4%. That being said, I think we need to be very careful for several reasons. First and foremost, people might be demotivated by voting for him and by mobilizing themselves. Will be voting in 2 weeks. It's going to be a long weekend. The Monday is a day off. People might be traveling and thinking, you know what, he's going to win anyhow. Why do we really need to go to vote? This will certainly not be the case for the voters of Marine Le Pen, who will be probably voting in masses. That's one thing I'm very concerned about. The other thing I'm concerned about is the fact that within the sort of far left and the extremist part of the far left, there are many similarities between the programs of the two candidates. It's anti-European, the idea of getting out of NATO, the idea of getting out of the euro. All of those aspects also exist in the far left. And my fear is that there will be a rather substantial part of those voters who will be voting for Marine Le Pen. Mm-hmm. And the other group where people could be voting for is within the traditional Republican Party, who really don't want to vote for someone who, for them, is a socialist, which is obviously not the case because he created his own party. But for them, the fact that he was the former Minister of Economy under François Hollande means that he's a socialist. And they'd much rather vote for Marine Le Pen than vote for him. And then lastly, the abstention. There is a feeling that none of the candidates are right. It's a very small number of people who actually voted for both candidates. It's 21%. It's not huge for Marine Le Pen and 24% for Emmanuel Macron. So if we have a huge abstention, I don't know, 50 or so percent, potentially in that case, she could win. So I think we will have to be very careful over the next 2 weeks.
It is so fascinating to hear you analyze the situation. It is so reminiscent in many ways of what America went through in the most recent presidential election. Simone, before you joined the AJC, you were an advisor to the Ambassador for Human Rights in the French Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs. As you look at the way in which the political scene has moved in general in France, to what extent are you worried about the future of individual human rights in France? And does this election in any way speak to that issue?
Sure, absolutely. First and foremost, again, coming back to the issue of anti-Semitism, there are always the first signs that you will always see are hate against minorities.
Yes.
And obviously, Jews are often the first ones, yes, but not only. Yes. So this is obviously a concern. Whenever we see profound problems within a liberal democracy, we will see hatred against Jews, hatred against other minorities being manifested. So I'm very concerned about this. I'm concerned about the fact that France, even if Emmanuel Macron wins, is in a profound crisis, a crisis that is not new, that we've seen for the past 15 years. So yes, I'm very concerned about this. By the way, not only am I concerned about minority rights, but I'm also concerned about women's rights. Mm-hmm. We are now suddenly starting to have conversations again about abortion rights, about all of the things that women managed to have over the last 50, 60 years here in France. And the same kind of conversation start again. National Front has also had in the past a position on the death penalty. As you know, France abolished the death penalty years ago. So we're having the kind of conversations again in France that many of us would have thought are over for a very long time.
Believe me, we understand 100%. So since I have you on, let me also ask you, sort of take the temperature of French Jewish life today. As you said, you've been on many times with me talking about how French Jewry is doing and the extent to which French Jewry has to deal with anti-Semitism. As we meet today, and as you and I are speaking, it's 2 days after the Jewish world commemorated Yom HaShoah, the day that commemorates the Holocaust. Simone, how is French Jewry doing these days?
Nervous. Nervous, concerned. By the way, as you mentioned, Yom HaShoah was on the 23rd.
Right.
On Sunday, it was also the second round of the presidential elections. The day we had the far right acceding to the second round of the presidential election. So it is, people are nervous, no doubt about it. It's, obviously the question arises again and again and again of what kind of future Jews and minorities have here in France. There is obviously continued security issues and threats, while the French government certainly has done a lot on combating anti-Semitism, and actually the numbers of anti-Semitic acts have gone down in 2016. The question, nevertheless, of course, arises: what happens with the next government? Will the next government be still as combative, as committed in fighting anti-Semitism? And if it's not the case, what is the future for Jews here in France? So I would say the term I would use is nervousness.
And are Jews as reluctant now to wear kippahs, yarmulkes, and to have public display of being Jewish as they have been in recent years?
Again, I mean, the overall answer is yes, but then it always depends where. There are neighborhoods where it doesn't pose a problem at all. There are, we have very nice neighborhoods in the middle of Paris where you don't have an issue with it. But then there are others where people would be very, very careful. Overall, I would say yes, and to that extent, things have not changed so much. And generally, there is a feeling of, how can I say, that Jews, to some extent, are paying the price of Islamist extremism as well. When Marine Le Pen, for example, says that she wants to ban all religious symbols in the public space, that would obviously include Jews being able to wear the yarmulke. Yes. Just today, Marine Le Pen said that she wants to ban ritual slaughter. Now, obviously, first and foremost, she speaks about halal meat, but of course, that would also concern Jews with unkosher meat. So Jews have a feeling that to some extent that they are paying the price as well in sort of a public debate about the place of religion in the public space that is rather uncomfortable.
Simone, you're doing fabulous work. It is always so wonderful to speak with you. You give clarity to what often is a most complicated situation. I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha, and I hope I can call you often. Be well, be safe, and we may speak after May 7th. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, Director of the American Jewish Committee's European Office. She's stationed in Paris. She is terrific. We will watch the French elections, and it is amazing how much they echo what we experienced here in America. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, and the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.